And now, actually, I should do that with the. Hang on a minute, guys. Hang on. Let's just do it with the help of our special effects. I'll be a monster for you.
And now, that sounds great. And now, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. The Drunken Tyromancy Show. A little bit of a delay. Hang on.
Right. Yeah, sorry. I have to walk back and forward to get to the different things here. Hold on a minute. So I thought what I would talk about today, and this is one that I knew I was going to do eventually. Hang on one second. So I thought I would talk about health and disease because for those of you who actually know me already, you'll be well aware of my interest in the field and where that comes from. So today I have written something first, and I'm going to stick more to, well, not reading it per se, but using it as a close guide again, just because I think this is a really good structure for what I wanted to say to you on this subject. And I've tried to write it, even though it is really kind of like a rushed job. If you go to one of the websites like Locals or Substack where I've actually published this, instead of just watching the video, you will see in the written article, it's a very kind of structured argument. So if you wanted to use it as a resource to explain to other people who might have been fooled into believing all sorts of kind of, crazy things that just make people rich but actually don't help their health, then, hopefully this will help you understand some really basic things about health and disease and how it relates to the frauds that are perpetrated on society by people under the guise of being in your best interests, when in fact it is very much not. So for the past 4 years now, heading on to 5 years, we've all been subjected to variations on an ongoing campaign, like a fear campaign that dates back decades, which is based upon utterly fraudulent science. And while I can see the possibility that there are many people within the field of academia and the so-called health and medicine professions who may very well have themselves innocently been fooled by or brainwashed into the fraud. Like, I'm not suggesting for a minute that everybody is in on it. They don't need to be. But it is quite easy to fool people into believing it. And this article will explain to you why, and I'll kind of go through things. But we've all been subjected to this. You all know what I'm talking about. Much of it contradicts previously well-established, fundamental, irrefutable arguments and principles and facts of science. And so I have been referring to this latest round of the fraud as the single most obvious fraud of any kind in the entire global history of fraud, because from my perspective, it stuns me that anybody ever fell for it for even a second. It is complete, absolute, utter bullshit from start to finish. I didn't hear them say a single thing in like 3 to 4 years, which I thought was remotely credible. Especially, and I'm kind of diverging a little bit here off my introduction from the article, but especially where it comes to the way that the people in the media and in the government and all their kind of official experts and authorities and stuff like that, they keep talking to the general public as like, trust the science and listen to the authority, listen to the expert. There is consensus, these kinds of words. Now, none of these things have got anything whatsoever to do with real solid science, okay? There is one thing and one thing only that takes a fact from being an unknown fact to a known fact, and that is a proof. If you do not have a proof, regardless of whether you may or may not accidentally or just through intuition or guesswork or whatever, you may very well have a fact, but you do not have a known fact until you have a proof. So what we have within the body of all the sort of academic work out there, ignoring for a minute all the fraud, and that's a big problem. There is a huge problem with academic fraud, which I will go into. But now the more money behind whatever is trying to be sold, the more likely there's going to be fraud. And because we are dealing with, in some cases, these global multi-trillion-dollar industries, there is a massive incentive financially to do fraud. And because, in addition to that, you have certain ideologies in the minds and hearts of the kind of sociopaths who are often at the very, very top of the food chain, right? Who are the biggest owners and biggest controllers of all of these corporations. So, as you might be well aware, there are open admissions on camera, both in text and on video, where they're basically talking about their belief that the world is overpopulated and they have to cull the population and all these kind of excuses for mass murder. There are methods in place where people try to keep the mistakes out and try to keep the fraud out. But whether or not there is a consensus, whether or not there are experts and authorities saying, yes, this is right, that's irrelevant. The only thing which establishes that a fact is a fact and known to be a fact is a proof. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that you're being told in the media that anybody who wrote any paper at all that was within the field of science and academia, and which the government is saying, yes, this is the official truth, they don't have a basis for saying that that is a known fact. They don't have financial incentives, political and ideological incentives to sell a product or to achieve an agenda, particularly, as we've spoken before, in the game of brinkmanship and the way that they want to use things for fear campaigns, often for commercial purposes or to gain power or whatever they're trying to do. You might have something which is otherwise factual and even proven, but you could just change the language slightly and add new conclusions on top. And because of the way that you word it, you could easily fool people who should really know better into thinking, hey, yeah, great, I never thought of that. And everybody just accepts it. Why? Because they're too busy with their own work to really take the time to think about it. But as I've had too much time on my hands, I did. So we've been faced with this fraud around health and disease, and I've written this and I'm talking to you now to help expose what these misunderstandings and frauds are all about. I'm not going to specifically label anyone in particular, even though I'm sure you all know the names of the people that I would. I'm sure you can guess, but I'm not going to do that for the purpose. This is just about teaching you how health and disease really work, what they really are, and how you can use that information to know when you're being lied to. The first thing that I want to get into is that if we want to understand health and disease, we first need to understand the concept of a system, because what health and disease are in terms of the meanings of the words and what they are in terms of what they point to, so they are labels, right? These are just words, labels. They have a meaning which points to a real world thing, right? So that real world thing they point to is a biological system which can experience health and disease. I'm going to refer to all of the things that they use as excuses to sell you the lie, but I'm going to show you a better hypothesis which uses the exact same data, comes to different conclusions, and unlike the narrative you've been told, it is not contradicted by more fundamental sciences. It is completely congruent with it. So firstly, on systems. So I've written quite a bit here to explain it to you, and I'll shortcut that a tad. Essentially, a system is a type of collection of things where we are not just concerned about the items or elements within the collection, but we are also concerned with their relationships to each other. Their state changes over time, which is how we look at like a state of an object or an element within a system is its current state of its properties and relationships and its functionality being expressed. So if you just snapshotted time and you said, right, it's in the middle of this action and it's currently colored red and it weighs this much and all these kind of details, you are describing its state. So each element of many elements within a system has functionality, has roles to perform, has relationships with other elements that it performs these roles with. Sometimes the role that it's performing is with itself. It might have a feedback loop. to itself. And the elements within these systems, within these relationships, they can pass resources to each other. So it's a way of viewing collections of things whereby we can see them as a system with elements, relationships, state changes over time, behavior, so on, and it has a boundary condition or some kind of defined boundary which determines what is inside the system and what is outside the system. And a really good example of this is a cell. So if you look at it at a biological level, your cells have a cell membrane. The cell membrane is the system boundary of the cell. The cell itself is a subsystem of a tissue of similar cells. And that tissue is a subsystem of an organ made of a collection of and system of tissues. So within the cell, we can look at its elements. So it's going to have like ribosomes and DNA and a nucleus and all sorts of little bits and pieces. But essentially, all I want you to do is just think of this as a system. And then if you collect a whole bunch of them, they are subsystems and sibling systems working within a parent or supersystem. So whether you view something as an element or a whole system is really just a matter of whether or not you want to know what's going on inside it and how it does things, or if you are just concerned about what comes in and what goes out. So if you keep on expanding this concept, you get to the point where you start to understand that you are a system, right? But more accurately, one would say that you are a complex system or a system of systems. So there are many systems working together. We can define the boundaries of each system. We can define the interactions between these systems. We can define the overlapping of systems. We can define all sorts of different things and look at how it operates. And if you've ever studied maths or electronics or computer science, you might know that in maths, and it works in other fields as well, you have this concept of superposition, where let's say that we break down a complex problem or a complex system into component parts, and we analyze the component parts in isolation from the rest of the system. If we look at what it does and how it does it, and we were to make a little model or map of that, and then we get the next element of that system and model that and superimpose it on the top of that one. And then we get the next element and model that and superimpose that on top. And we keep doing this. And if you imagine them as like kind of transparent layers, like it was like an overhead projector, and you put down one transparency with some stuff on it, and then you put another one down, and you can see through that to the other one. And as far as the projector is concerned, it can no longer see either separately. It now sees them both merged, right? Because it's just shining a light through these two thin sheets, which have got different stuff on them, but together they project this. Through looking at the kind of the net totals of everything, what you actually get is a really good approximation of the real whole system. So systems are a collection of things where we have elements, we have relationships, we have properties and functions and state changes and so forth, and we have energy and resources moving around, being stored, being transformed, and being imported and exported from that system. In the case of a cell, the system actually includes the system boundary because the cell membrane actually has functions of its own. The body is trying to prevent itself from decaying faster than it can gain new resources, faster than it can repair itself. Your body has this kind of slow leakage of resources to the external environment. And your body is trying to minimize that by sending resources through pathways and through processes and into storage and all sorts of different things so that each resource can be used and beneficial as many times as possible to maintain the balance. And because our bodies are so good at doing that, we maintain a state of health. And this is where we come into what health and disease really are. So health, and I've put this definition, I'll actually just read this bit straight to you here. So health is simply a systemic state of balanced and sustainable function without significant, non-transitory, or significantly degrading dysfunction, right? So you may have like little bits of dysfunction here and there, but if you don't really notice them as symptoms of, like some kind of real problem that's actually stopping you from functional expression, then there is no significant dysfunction as a whole system that we would call a disease. And the very fact that cells are dying and replicating and getting damaged and getting repaired or getting replaced where they die, like all this stuff goes on all the time. So you could, at a smaller level, looking at these subsystems of cells and tissues, you could argue that they are kind of always, at least partially, in a state of dysfunction as all this stuff goes on. But the fact is it's being repaired and replaced faster than it damages, and so the overall functionality remains. So hence we don't actually have any symptoms to define any state other than health. So that's what health is this balance. It's a dynamic thing, it's a changing thing, but overall we don't have any significant dysfunction. This allows us, of course, to define disease just as easily. Because we've looked at systems, because we've now looked at health, disease is simply the opposite. So disease is conversely a systemic state of significant systemic dysfunction, and possibly that dysfunction increasing over time or getting worse, right? Any specific disease is simply a name or label applied to a set or system of symptoms, all of which are necessarily certain in every patient. The purpose of naming a disease is not to say that there is some physical object, here's a lump of this disease and we can weigh it and measure it. You can't do that. There's no substance there. It's a systemic state. But here for yourself, prevention, treatment and cure. So I covered that already, but just briefly, I was basically just saying that ideally you want prevention. If you can't, in the absence of prevention, get a cure, then what you're trying to do is treat the symptoms, improve quality of life, if possible, improve quality of life and extend life while you're searching for other answers. There's a lot more money for the corporations in perpetual treatment rather than cure. Where we kind of really get into the perpetration of the fraud is when they start using the words infection and contagion, and specifically where they start using them interchangeably as if they are synonyms, because once again here, these are not synonymous words. They're not. An infection is talking about where you have a part of the body which has become infected or invaded by a bacterium which is growing into a colony, eating your flesh and your blood and so forth, and it has infected the area. Now, that does not mean you have a disease. For contagion to exist, disease has to be a substance, because that's what contagion means. It is a contagion as a noun is a disease substance, right? There is no disease substance for any disease. Not even cancer. Let's put it this way. A cancerous cell is a cell undergoing a cancerous or diseased systemic state, whereby the elements of that cell are dysfunctional in a certain way. And, that systemic state of dysfunction is a disease that we call cancer. And you could try to backdoor it and argue, well, therefore, a cancerous cell is a contagion substance, because if we take that cancerous cell and put it into a non-cancerous body and suppress the immune system, they will then get cancer. What you said is true, but that still doesn't make it a contagion, because it's not the disease you're passing. The disease is a thing being suffered by that cell. If you put it into another creature and then suppress that creature's immune system, so that instead of wiping out this invading cancerous cell, as it would normally do, unless it's doing that, then under the circumstance of having the immune system suppressed, that cancerous cell is going to replicate and replicate and replicate. And as it does so, it's going to cause a dysfunction even in the originating cells of that body that you put it into, right? and they are then going to experience that cancerous state, and then they will start replicating it too, right? But what was being passed was not a diseased substance. It was a diseased substance, a substance suffering from a disease, and which had, under certain circumstances, a probability of causing or contributing to the manifestation of the same disease in surrounding cells. It's not the same thing as saying that it's a contagion, a actual disease substance. No disease substance exists for any disease. And so you have to understand this difference between the words infection and contagion. And I've gone into in the article here where I've talked a lot about bacterium and parasites, gone into infectious disease here, and just quickly, so an infectious disease, again, might be confused as being synonymous with the phrase a contagious disease. But again, not the same thing, and the latter is, again, a fraud. You do not catch, you do not carry, you do not pass on or spread the disease. There are some things which do get carried, caught, and spread, but they are not a disease substance. There is no contagion, right? We can pass bacterium around. They are not diseases, they are organisms. And in passing them around, those people whom are vulnerable because of other reasons may then subsequently manifest a disease. But even if we had the exact same disease manifested because we had the same or similar vulnerabilities, it wasn't the disease we passed them. They didn't catch the disease from us. What they got was a bacterium. And the reason why nobody else got sick was because there was no disease to pass them. It was just a thing that they were in a perfectly healthy state. Their body had evolved over billions of years from all of our ancestors to deal with that. Our bodies know how to deal with it. But just those people who were vulnerable, who could not handle that interaction, they are the ones that get sick because they were vulnerable, not because they were given a disease, because they had to interact with something which they were already in a vulnerable state to deal with as they otherwise would. And every single day of our lives, without exception, we deal with these interactions and we don't even notice. We deal with them on a constant basis and we don't even notice. And we deal, and what I mean by that is like literally this. We have probably in the order of trillions or more of such interactions every single day of our entire life without fail, right? Trillions of them. If it were true that there was a contagion disease substance and it was carried and caught and passed and spread, don't you think with such a large set of incidences and opportunities for them to spread this disease, that surely we would get a disease every single day? There's trillions of opportunities, right? But you see, that's not what's happening. It's just a misinterpretation of the data. We have these things passing around. Our bodies know how to deal with it. Like a lot of it is completely harmless under normal circumstances. Some of it is even beneficial under normal circumstances. But give it a different set of circumstances and it becomes harmful. The same thing is true of nutrients, and I'll go into that in a minute. So an infectious disease is really just a disease which results from an infectious agent, such as a bacterium or parasite. But a contagion is a fraud, and that is where we are claiming that you catch, carry, or spread a disease substance, a contagion, and somebody else gets the disease from you. They don't get the disease from you. That is your systemic state. They might develop the same systemic state or a similar systemic state, and if everybody gets it, then the illusion is quite great. We see, it's proof. See, it's definitely contagion. They all got it. But the problem with that thinking is that you are just leaping to a conclusion. It is also possible that they all just happened to have the same nutritional deficiency, especially in a world like ours where there are so many shitty things being sold as food and beverages which are just garbage for your body. And even some medicines that are supposed to be therapeutic but which are arguably poisons, and I'll go into that as well. there is the differences between two foods of the exact same type, but grown in different ways, or processed in different ways, so that one version of them is quite unhealthy and the other version is quite healthy. Just to give you a quick example of that, I remember my father telling me that I think it was like the vitamin C content of apples back in the day, where they were a bit more bitter. Those apples had something like 20 times the amount of vitamin C in them than the apples that you are buying today, which are really full of sugars and they taste really nice, but from a nutritional point of view, they are nutritionally poor. What you want is nutritionally dense foods, right? And the greater the nutritional density, then you are getting more nutrients per calorie consumed, and this will really, really help you with your health. And generally speaking as well, the types of foods that have that are also going to be very, very high in the kind of compounds and things that are very good for your gut biome. And because your health is so intertwined with your gut biome, it is vitally important to keep that in good health too. So this whole concept of contagion is really just a misreading of data, but I suspect it actually is also a fraud, particularly where I've watched, especially over the last few years, as it has been used to perpetrate what was absolutely a fraud and to get people to take stuff that was supposed to be medicine, but which was arguably a toxic poison. On the subject of that particular case, we know that the all-cause mortality statistics effectively goes through a wave every year where there is a higher total death rate around winter. Right? Why is this? Because the elderly, who have been through many things in life, they have, suffered diseases that they didn't quite get over. They've worked hard. They've had injuries that didn't quite heal, and little bit on little bit, it all kind of builds up until they start getting very tired. They lose their energy. They're indoors more often. They get vitamin D deficient. So around winter, vitamin D deficient, various other reasons, along comes some kind of trigger, not necessarily a virus. It could be any kind of trigger, really, but viruses are one of them, and I'll go into this later as well. But along comes the trigger, and with the stress caused on the body, with the resource usage required from the body to deal with that trigger and whatever it's doing, you place that person under an even greater burden. And during the winter, when they're vitamin D deficient and other things, like that's got a higher probability of just wiping a bunch of them out because they're already vulnerable, right? So it wasn't that they were given a disease. It was just something happened, any kind of trigger, which puts them in that situation where in their present state, they cannot cope with what is required and they just decline very, very quickly and then they die. Right? Or they just get really, really super sick as well. And that can happen to people much younger too, where they just happen to be in an extremely stressed state, or they just happen to, especially with the poor, who it's like if they are nutritionally deficient because they can't eat every day, and what they do eat is scraps that they might even find from dumpster diving and all sorts of things like that, right? They're struggling to get the nutrition that they need. And so along comes the kind of winter period and all this kind of stuff, and they're in that vulnerable state, maybe even homeless, sleeping on the street. It could be very, very cold, so maybe they're freezing to death, or maybe it's like by the combination of the cold and other things, they just pass away. You can see, I hope, how this illusion is manifested, because once you misuse these words, then it's very, very easy to interpret what you see happening as a disease passing around. But the fact is, just on the most rudimentary level, that is a misuse of language, first of all, right? It is not a disease passing around. A disease is a systemic state. You cannot pass your systemic state to somebody else. It's impossible. It cannot be done. It's illogical to even suggest it. All you can do is you can, at most, pass around things which might, under certain conditions, cause pressures and stresses and resource depletion, which for a certain person may cause disease. Or you can put people in an environment where the environmental conditions, there's nothing being passed around between the people. It might have the illusion of that, but in reality, they are all just in an environmental condition where they are all exposed to the same thing. And if you don't know that's what it is, and if somebody else who has power and control over kind of big fields of science and engineering and pharmacology and stuff like that, if they tell you, this is caused by a virus, and what they do is they go and pay somebody, go and find us a virus and prove that it exists and show that it's in all of these people, right? And they'll do that for sure, right? That allows them to sell their product. And there is a famous phrase used in science which basically says correlation is not causation. So if you can correlate that all these people came into contact with each other, if you can correlate that they all had a particular bacterium present, if you can correlate that they all had a particular fungus or virus present or whatever thing present, you still haven't proved causation. Causation is proved by showing the chemical pathways from the thing that you are claiming as the cause all the way through to all the damage that it does, leading to the disease and showing that as being the primary cause. Now, you could also group it together with many other things and prove that kind of chemical pathway to it being not the primary cause, but a contributing factor amongst many. And together, this set of circumstances, gradually, you could prove that, leading to the formation of the disease. But none of this stuff means contagion, right? It doesn't. All it means is that a bunch of people had a correlation of some common factor, but that doesn't mean they caught the disease off each other. They can't. It's not a substance.